Hey you guys, it's Cece, and today I am here to talk about the books that I read in the month of September. My sweatshirt is my favorite because it reminds me of my main man Ernie from Sesame Street, and I think it's always a good day when something that you're wearing reminds you of a favorite Muppet. Also, just finally went and got all my hair chopped off, and it feels amazing to have things off of my neck. So I read 10 things in the month of October, which is amazing. It's a huge turnaround for my September reading month. It just seems like because packing has been so overwhelming, and one of the first things that I did unpacking was unpack all my books, I've been reading a lot more this month. For a while, I was just like reading constantly and getting through so many books. But yeah, I'm gonna be doing mini reviews for the 10 books that I read in the month of October. We're going to start with my least favorite of the month and work up to my most favorite of the month. It's an October wrap-up. Let's get going. So my least favorite book that I read in the month of October is Here There Are Monsters by Amelinda Berube. Yeah. I feel really sad that I didn't enjoy this because this is the book that some of you helped me pick back at the beginning of October. I did like a poll. I have 2 of this author's books and more people wanted me to read this. I'm really sad that I wound up like absolutely hating this book. To be fair, I also thought it sounded like the more interesting read. It's just that all of the things that I was like, this is what it's supposed to be like, this is the description, wound up being super disappointing, so we were all duped. We were all duped by this summary. So this is about a girl named Deirdre? No, Sky. See, I don't even remember anymore. This is about a 16-year-old girl named Sky. Her and her family have just moved to this new area, and Sky is trying to get a fresh start away from her sister. Her sister is this person who's always been very caught up in myth and magic, and she won't live in the real world. And something happened at the last place they lived where Sky was like, enough, I'm not playing along with these games anymore. I refuse to be close to you anymore. So they're starting fresh. And her younger sister, Deirdre, is really resenting her for kind of moving away from their sistership, and then her sister disappears, and Sky kind of has to set out to try to find her. I guess is the description of this. Nothing happens in this book. It's not scary. Anything that might have been scary is undercut so that it's not scary anymore, and maybe it's just because I've built up a tolerance for scarier books. Maybe some people would find this a little more eerie, but I was just bored. I was so bored for like every page of this. And what I kept telling myself during the first half was, okay, it's going this slow to set up the world. This is all stuff that we're going to need to know, and all of it is going to be paid off in a second half. No. Just nothing happens in the second half too. And then the ending, like, made me actually mad. I found it so dumb. No, I was trying to read this because it says on the back the Blair Witch Project meets imaginary girls, and I was like, ooh, that sounds super scary. It's just not. It's just about this little sister who is awful. She's like the worst. So anytime Sky tries to do anything for her, you're kind of like, okay, it's because they're sisters. There's got to be some kind of reason, and there just never is. This little sister is intolerable, and the build is for nothing. There's no build, there's no point. I didn't like this. I reserve my 1 stars for books that contain harmful representation, so this didn't have any harmful representation, thus I'm giving it 2 stars. Just know that, like, there's nothing here for me. Next up, we have The Night Sister by Jennfier McMahon, or Man? I don't know. I picked this up a secondhand bookstore because I recognized the author's name and I was interested in the story of this because it sounded creepy. Like, to be fair, I got through this book very, very quickly. It's just that the ending sucked. Which is like my eternal problem with thrillers. I feel like I've read maybe 4 good thrillers. 3 of those are by Gillian Flynn. And other than those, I've never read a thriller that has a satisfying ending. It just builds and builds and builds, and then it gets to the end, and you're like, what was the fucking point of all of the time I just spent reading this? And that applies to this. This is about... oh god. This is about a small town in Vermont. It is set at a motel called the Tower Motel, which in the 60s... or not even in the 60s. It used to be thriving. By the time it gets to the 60s, it's kind of starting to fail. So yeah, actually it's in the 50s. In the 50s, it's doing pretty well, and then a highway comes through and it kind of ruins the Tower Motel. Think of the plot of Cars. That's what happened to this motel. So you're getting a few different storylines. You have the story in the 50s, which is about these two sisters, Rose and Sylvie, and they are the young daughters of the people who own the Tower Motel. And Rose is becoming more and more convinced that her sister Sylvie, who is like this golden child, this perfect child, she thinks that she's a monster. And so you're getting bits of that story. Then in the 80s, you have Rose's daughter Amy, and then her two friends Piper and Margot. Piper and Margot are also sisters, and they are trying to uncover the mystery of Rose and Sylvie and the Tower Motel. And then you have 2013, which begins with Amy murdering everybody in her family, and so Piper and Margot have to go back to the Tower Motel and try to figure out if Amy really was the reason, because the only thing that's left behind is she had a picture of Rose and Sylvie, and on the back it said 29 rooms, even though there are only 28 rooms in the Tower Motel. So all of that is happening, and everything is brilliant. I thought this was going to be like a glowing recommendation, 4-star read, and then the end just kind of happens, and it feels like a rushed job to explain everything that's been going on in the book, and there's not really a purpose to it. I've been going on about all of these books for too long. This is going to be the longest wrap-up. Basically, this is pretty scary. There were multiple times that I was getting really creeped out by it. I was preferring to read it during the day instead of at night alone. This had a lot of vibes of like The Shining or Haunting of Hill House, the TV and movie of each of those things. I haven't read the books, sorry. It's just that it had a really disappointing ending. So if you're the kind of person who can read thrillers and not have the ending ruin the entire experience, I recommend it. Personally, the ending really impacts how I read books, so I wound up knocking this down to like a 3-star read. Oh, and this does have one queer main character. Piper is described as bisexual, which I didn't know before going into it, but there you go. Next up we have Wilder Girls by Rory Power. This was the book that my patrons chose for me to read in the month of October, and this was the group pick for my caravan reading group. So we all read Wilder Girls together in the month of October, and gotta say, the opinion I'm about to give is not one in the minority. Most of us didn't really like this book. But if you're interested in joining the Caravan reading group, we're going to be reading a new book. I've been saying October this whole time, haven't I? Oh my god. This is my September wrap-up, the books I read in September. In October, we're going to be reading a new book in that reading group, so maybe join in. The link is in the description below. God, I'm a mess. This is set on a small island off the coast of Maine, at the Raxter School for Girls, where a couple years earlier, this thing called the Talks basically swept through all of the people who lived at Raxter, and it has started to morph all of the girls' bodies into something strange and horrific. And it morphs each body in a different way, so they all have different things that have happened to them. Hetty, the main character, one of her eyes seared shut, and there's something growing behind it, so there's like a lot of body horror elements. And then another one of the girls, Byatt, goes missing, and so Hetty has to decide if she's going to break quarantine with her other friend, Reese, in order to find Byatt. This is just fine, basically. That is the takeaway. It's very slow and very distant, so you don't ever really come to care about any of these characters. You don't even really get to know any of these characters. Like, when I finished reading this book, I didn't feel like I could give you a firm character description of Hetty or Byatt or Reese. Like, there was just sort of this distance between them and the story that didn't work well. Also, I think I was hoping for more horror, more body horror especially, and those scenes were very sparing, and they were some of my favorite scenes in the book. There was one scene that is particularly frightening and upsetting, and that was like my favorite scene because it's what I was looking for. I think, in the minority on saying that I actually like how this book ends. A lot of people didn't like how it ends because many people feel the ending was abrupt or that they wanted more. I liked it. I actually wish there had been less explanation at the end. this was just kind of forgettable, which is upsetting considering it was like my second most anticipated release of the year. I will say that Hetty, the main character, is queer, as are a bunch of the other girls in the book, but yeah, it was fine. I gave it 3 stars. Super sad. I also read Pan's Labyrinth, The Labyrinth of the Faun by Guillermo del Toro and Cornelia Funke, with art by Alan Williams. This is basically a reinterpretation of Pan's Labyrinth, the film, as told by Cornelia Funke, so it's just kind of a novelization of that story. I think this is a really interesting storybook version. Like, I could see me keeping this around for in a few years. If I ever have, like, a middle grade child I could gift this book to. For me, it didn't bring that much new to the story of Pan's Labyrinth. I'm not a huge fan of the movie. I like the movie, so I was hoping that this would kind of flesh out the movie for me, give me more. It's just very beat for beat, the movie. You get to know a couple of additional character motivations and that's kind of it, so it just felt a little unnecessary. It was still well written, and it was still a cool story that I think maybe if you hadn't seen the movie, this could be interesting. It is written very much like a storybook. There are storybook illustrations, occasional full-page illustrations, like that. And then that's how the pages look. So it was good. Ultimately somewhat forgettable. I guess I wish that there had been more of Cornelia's style here, because that's why I reached for it. Cornelia Funke is one of my favorite authors. She's the author that introduced me to fantasy, so I think I was chasing more of her style than I really was going to find in this book. I wound up giving it about 3.5 stars. Next up, we have Life is Wonderful, People Are Terrific by Meliza Banales, which was one of my top 10 to read in 2019 books, so I did it. So this is a book set in the 1990s, and it is basically exploring queer Chicana culture of the 90s, 90s feminism, all of the different styles of 90s feminism. This is about a girl named Missy Fuego who has just started her freshman year at college, and she is going to this prestigious college during the week, and then she's stripping on the weekends, and it's just her kind of trying to find her place. She's kind of a fucked up person who's gone through some stuff that hasn't gone well. Coming out to her mother and father didn't go well. She's constantly struggling for money. She's constantly struggling to find her place. And then she keeps discovering these different subcultures of girls between Santa Cruz, where she goes to school, and no, it might be the reverse. It's set in Santa Cruz and it's set in San Francisco, and there is a bit where she happens on Riot Girls and kind of discovers that. She's also a punk, so there's a ton about 90s punk culture. Ultimately, this is one of the weirder books I've ever read. Like, that's why I have a hard time describing what it's about, really, because it jumps around so much. I think self-published and indie-published books are always such a departure from the norm because there are so many rules they don't have to follow to appeal to traditional publishing. So whenever you're picking up a self-published book or an indie published book, you're going to be most likely getting something very off the wall. And if you're looking for something a little apart from the norm, I would recommend this. I would say there's a lot of drug use, there is a lot of alcohol abuse, there's some trigger warnings for attempted sexual assault, some triggers for physical assault, and there's a lot of sex. I thought it was a fascinating look at this particular time, and I thought it's unlike anything that I have ever read before. I wound up giving this 3.5 out of 5 stars. It was like good and I'm going to remember it, but it wasn't kind of a standout favorite for me. I do wonder if it's one I'm going to enjoy more as I continue to revisit it through the years, because like I would have loved to have read this when I was still going to college, when I could have written like feminist papers on this, because there's so much here and it's fascinating. So 3.5 out of 5 stars. I do recommend it. Just be prepared. It's going to be a wild ride. Next, we have a book that is going to be released at the beginning of November. That is The Forgotten Girl. This is by India Hill Brown. It is a middle grade book about a girl and her best friend. The girl's name is Iris. Her best friend is Daniel. And on the night of the first snow, her and Daniel sneak out to play in the snow and happen upon a forgotten grave of a young girl. And as they do more research, it turns out that this girl is buried in a forgotten, segregated cemetery, and Iris starts to be haunted by the ghost of this girl as she demands to be remembered. This is a brilliant middle grade novel. I absolutely loved reading this. I would say that despite the fact that I was reading adult fiction and YA fiction, the only middle grade book that I consumed in the month of September was the scariest one. This had some true scary elements. This ghost is frighteningly described, and it's very eerie to read. But it is also a really beautiful look at segregated cemeteries, of a past of these kids trying to bring awareness into their modern day schooling life. It's also about Iris facing kind of everyday racism, how she deals with that, alongside her family. She is the step captain at her school, and she keeps sort of being passed over and forgotten, even though all of the other heads of all the other clubs are being recognized. The Forgotten Girl is a brilliantly accurate title. I highly recommend this book when it comes out on November 5th. I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I also listened to The Collapsing Empire by John Scalzi. This is the book that I listened to when my roommate and I, when we were driving from Utah to Washington, moving. This is about a 10-hour audiobook. It's narrated by Will Wheaton. And this is a sprawling adult sci-fi book about something called the Interdependency, a group of planets that all have to rely on each other in order to survive, and warp travel isn't possible, but they have found something called the Flow, and the Flow is an area that kind of just takes ships through space, and the Flow travels to a variety of different areas, and this is about 3 different characters. There's the woman who is about to be named the new emperor of the Interdependency. There is a guy who lives on a planet called End, which is at the far end of the galaxy. He is a scientist, and then there is a woman named Kiva who is on a ship, and she works for her family, and she is transporting stuff to End. I'm doing my best to describe this book. It's wild. This has one main character who's a character of color, and there are a bunch of other characters of color as well, and then Kiva is bisexual. I loved this. I don't know if I would have gotten through this if I hadn't listened to it on audiobook, because it felt like it was moving quite slowly, but it works. When you're driving for 10 hours, it doesn't feel like it's moving slowly, because at least something's keeping you company for 10 hours. I would die for Kiva. I would just lick the ground where Kiva has walked. She is the biggest bitch in the world, and I live for it. I would say if you like adult sci-fi, you probably already know that John Scalzi exists. You may even know about the series already, but I recommend it if you haven't checked it out already. The second book is already out, and the third book is coming out next April, so I have a while to wait before I can complete this trilogy, but it is definitely one that I'm going to continue forward reading, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I also have Tarnished Are the Stars by Rosiee Thor. This is being released on October 15th, so getting this review in just before its release date. This is YA sci-fi. And it is about 3 different characters. There is Nathaniel. He is the son of the commissioner on something called the settlement. There's a girl named Anna who is an outlaw. The commissioner of the settlement is trying to capture her because she's something called the technician, because she gets medical technology to people despite the fact that medical technology is illegal in the settlement. And then there's a character named Eliza who is the eyes of the queen. So she's a spy and assassin for the queen, and she is engaged to Nathaniel. This is really excellent. It took me a while to read, but I think it's because I was getting so invested in the world building aspects of it that it took me a little bit longer to get invested in the characters themselves. Nathaniel is asexual and aromantic. Those are both words that are used on the page, and Eliza and Anna kind of start to be involved in this female-female romance. Like, when they meet each other, there's kind of this immediate spark. That's kind of all I want to say, besides the fact that this is brilliant. I absolutely love Nathaniel and Eliza and Anna, and I think what is most remarkable about this is if you like characters who have conversations about things that are upsetting them, and through those conversations, they begin to understand one another, and if someone is messed up, as they talk through it, they're like, oh, I see how you were wrong, and I see how I was wrong. Here's specifically how I will do better, and the other person's like, that is completely fair. Here's how I will do better so that we can go back to being friends. Like, just really healthy communication is a hallmark of this book, and I lived for it. I also think there's a lot as far as complex relationships between children of abusive parents and how that complex relationship works. Particularly, that is the case for Nathaniel. But I think Eliza is also somewhat dealing with that. As the Eyes of the Queen, she very much sees herself as the Queen's heir. And so you're dealing with both of those things as well. It's just really, really excellent. I loved it. I think my only issue with this book is that it wrapped up a little fast. It felt like a lot of things happened very suddenly in the last 50 or so pages, and this could have been a duology, but even if it wasn't, it was still a really excellent book that I highly recommend you check out. Like I said, it's coming out October 15th. Please read it. The best Arrow Ace feels, the best female-female romance feels. If I could film my favorite female-female romance books again right now, it would include this book. Second to last, we have Blanca Roja by Anna Marie McLemore. This is a YA magical realism book that is a retelling of Snow White and Rose Red, plus kind of a retelling of Swan Lake. Anna Marie McLemore is pretty celebrated on, like, the queer bookish internet. I have only read their other book, Wild Beauty, but I really want to read everything they've written. So this is about 4 characters, Blanca and Roja, obviously, who are sisters. These 2 sisters who should be pitted against each other because every single generation of this family, there are 2 daughters, and every generation one of those daughters is taken and turned into a swan. And it's always this eternal countdown for these 2 daughters as to who is going to be taken, who is going to lose her human body. And so Blanca and Roja should be enemies, but instead they are the closest of sisters who love each other with every ounce that they have inside of them to love with. But it's also dealing with colorism because Blanca was born with golden hair, with light skin, and Roja was born with incredibly dark skin and this dark red hair, and so they have experienced the world in supremely different ways, and everyone is sure that Roja is going to be taken because she isn't as able to pass as a white girl. She isn't able to experience the world the same way that Blanca does. But at the same time, Blanca refuses to be the one who is left behind because she could not take losing her little sister. This is also about 2 other characters, Paige and we'll go with Yearling, although he also goes by Barkley. Paige is a non-binary boy who is kind of running from the fact that her parents don't really understand her identity. They want Paige to choose if she/her is going to be what works best or he/him is going to work best, and Paige doesn't have an answer because both of those pronouns make him happy. Yearling, on the other hand, has been raised by a family who abuses him, particularly his cousin, and he has discovered something terrible about his family and has also run away. And all 4 of these people, their lives converge at once, and this is a really beautiful book. I think what is remarkable about Anna Marie McLemore's writing is her ability to write, like, the most gorgeous prose. There are so many pages that I want to read over and over again because of the lyrical descriptions, because of the beauty, and because of these characters, and they flesh out these characters so incredibly well. Despite the fact that there's a plotline of this book that is sort of built on a misunderstanding, it is always clear exactly how that misunderstanding could have taken place and exactly what will need to be done in order to fix it. This is just suffused with love. It's suffused with all these different kinds of love, whether it is romantic, whether it is platonic. It feels like a fairy tale snapshot, which is exactly what it's supposed to be. It's a retelling of 2 different fairy tales, but it does all of that so well. I really, really loved this. I wound up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. Usually, I didn't cry reading this book. I really thought I was going to. I sobbed reading the end of Wild Beauty, which is why that one got a slightly higher rating, but just like I reserve my 1 stars for books where I think the representation is harmful, I kind of reserve my 5 stars for books that impact me that emotionally, and I didn't quite cry reading this. It might change on a reread, but it's still a brilliant book that I highly, highly recommend, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And finally, I want to talk about Ecco After Ecco by Amy Rose Capetta, which this was included in my favorite female-female romances in books video, if you want to go watch that. This is a YA mystery set in New York. It is about a girl named Zara who has just gotten her dream role in a Broadway production. She's going to play Ecco in Ecco and Aristan. But when she gets to the Broadway stage, on the first day, she finds a dead body, the body of the show's lighting designer. So it is kind of an eerie start to this role, and as she becomes more and more invested in Ecco as a character in this stage, in the odd director who kind of plucked her out of obscurity, more things start to happen, more death starts to follow, and at the same time, Zara is falling for the new lighting designer, Ellie. This is such a brilliant book. I gave this book 4.5 out of 5 stars. It wasn't quite a 5-star read. I have been reading this for like over a year though, so I literally started this last October, so I finished it at the beginning of September. Let's celebrate that. What is so remarkable about Amy Rose Capetta for me is that the way she writes fantasy, it doesn't change when she writes contemporary. It's still like she's writing a fantasy book. I read her book, The Brilliant Death, which is somewhere. Found it. The Brilliant Death last year, and it's like a really gorgeous, interesting fantasy book, and it's so wild because this fantasy book set in an Italian-inspired world in like the 1700s has the same style of writing as a YA contemporary set in like 2017 New York. It makes everything beautiful, it makes all of the descriptions so vibrant, and it makes this romance just kind of jump to new heights. I would say if you are a fan of Nina LaCour's writing, particularly her writing in Everything Leads to You, Ecco After Ecco should be your next book. I hope that someday this can get as much acclaim as Everything Leads to You did, because I think it's very worthy of a whole lot of praise. So, I absolutely love this, and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Okay, and that's it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of September. I hope some of this video made sense, considering it feels like I keep tripping over my own tongue. Who knows? You let me know. If you've read any of these books, please let me know some of your personal thoughts about them down in the comments below. Plus, let me know what your favorite book was that you read in the month of September. Other than that, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!